So I want to play these two clips because it's so relevant to what I'm going to speak today. So was Yusuf, the faculty, the university at large, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you about my book. This book is proudly a product of UWC. There are so many people across the institution that I'm grateful, and I would like to thank them. This book is about the problematic colored identity and the attempted erasure of the Khoekhoe and San people in South Africa. This erasure started in 1652, and it's still ongoing in present-day post-apartheid South Africa. There were two types of erasure. The first is genocide, and the second is bureaucratic. President Thabo Mbeki, in his I Am an African speech, recognizes the first genocide. The second type of erasure started in 1828 with Ordinance 50 in the Cape Colony. From 1828, the Khoekhoe and San were bureaucratically erased, and their final erasure was supposed to be with the 1950 Population Registration Act. But this attempt failed because since 1652, the Khoekhoe and San resisted their subjugation and erasure. This book traces this resistance to the present. This book is largely influenced by three events. The first is the Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall movements, which rock the foundation of higher education in post-apartheid South Africa. These movements started a year after I enrolled for my PhD at the University of the Western Cape. Since my dissertation focused on the ongoing conflict in the Great Lakes region in Africa, I was able to distinguish the various forms of violence that made this such a ground-shifting event. I was able to recognize the invisible structural violence of higher education institutions that triggered these movements. I also saw and experienced the physical and overt acts of violence by the police and students. However, it quickly became apparent to me, where I saw two sides of the same coin, that many of my colleagues in higher education did not share my balanced view of the violence. The second event was the screening of Strike Rock at the Center for Humanities Research at the University of the Western Cape. For the screening took place in 2017, and it was the third year of the ongoing Fees Must Fall protests on campuses across South Africa. Strike Rock is a documentary film about a group of women in Kaneng in the aftermath of the 2012 Marikana massacre. While the film was welcomed by many of my colleagues, I was critical of the film's portrayal of black children. I did not like how black children were used as props in the film. They were merely employed for empathetic responses from the audience. Additionally, for me, the film perpetuated a specific image of black people in South Africa. And this was a result of a longer colonial tradition where the camera was used to inflict an incredible amount of suffering on indigenous people in South Africa. This tradition was perverted and pornographic in nature. These images stripped the indigenous of their agency, and they were always presented as subjects of research, pity, or pain. If it were not for Strike Rock and the fallout after the screening, I would have never taken up documentary filmmaking. Documentary filmmaking enabled me to tell a different story about the marginalized in society. I now use the lens in creative ways to tell the story of the struggle of university students, communities, and people in general. I tell stories that liberate them from the popular pity and suffering trope. The third and most significant event was growing up in the Namakoland. I was born and raised on a farm called Khoekhoe. I was raised by my grandparents who were farm workers. It was on this farm that I was introduced to my Khoekhoe identity, an identity that the education system, society, and the state stripped from me. I remember my grandmother always told me that she was a bastard. Now, if you guys don't know what a bastard means, it's another reference to Khoekhoe. And my grandfather told us that his father spoke a click language. However, My great-grandfather refused to teach my grandfather and his siblings the language because he knew the violence that came with speaking that language. Whilst my grandmother grew up in a Makoland in the Kamisberg, my grandfather grew up in the Bushmanland. They lived and negotiated their existence in these two regions. For them, this was home. Even though my grandparents were classified by the apartheid state as colored, it was always foreign to them. They never used the colored identity to refer to themselves, their family, or their ancestors. They also never raised us to be colored people. Instead, they kept their Khoekhoe identity alive. My grandfather's task was to teach us the ancient knowledge of the veld, and my grandmother's task was to teach us some aspects of the religion and customs of the Khoekhoe. What a lot of people doesn't know is that the religion is still alive. It's called voorgebruike in the Makoland of bygeloof. Many of the teaching contain traces of the Khoekhoe languages, like it was explained just now. My grandparents trusted traditional medicinal practices more than Western medicine. Growing up, the medicine I was exposed to was traditional medicine. For every ailment, there was a traditional medicine that could treat it. My grandmother taught me the different medicinal plants and their purposes. She also showed me how to prepare and administer it. At this moment, at home, there is kalkoentjiebos. A week ago, I was in the Makoland, so it's flowering during winter season, so it's everywhere for us. So I have it at home. My grandmother made sure that we were exposed to the culture. He made sure that we know the kabara. We never knew the real dance. The real dance is an invention of the Atikafi. We knew the kabara. And we had a sense of belonging. It was when I entered the basic education system that I encountered another view of our values. It was also here that I encountered the backward and uncivilized Hottentot and Bushman figures. It was at the school that I realized that people who lived in town looked down upon us. Many called us Bushman or Plaas Yapi. It is in the basic education system that my first education, the education of my grandparents, was rendered backwards and discarded. Instead, we were forced to learn of the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck and the civilizing mission he started. We were conditioned to accept everything that was written in textbooks. Your grades and progress in basic education depended on how well you could recite what was written in these books. And slowly but surely, the erasure of my Khoekhoe past took place. I had to make space for the colored identity. They wanted us to be ashamed of our ancestry so that we could reject it. We had to make space for the so-called colored identity, a civilized version of the Hottentot and Bushman identities. This version made the Khoekhoe and San landless figures with no history and no real sense of belonging to South Africa. When I entered the university, I realized they appropriated the knowledge of the Khoekhoe and San. The university presented itself as the custodian of my ancestral knowledge. Some academics and disciplines are now the authoritative figures on Khoekhoe and San knowledge systems. It became clear that the university was complicit in the attempt to erase the Khoekhoe and San. Some universities are now the custodians and beneficiaries of the Khoekhoe and San artifacts and knowledge. Many research papers, books, theses, patents based on Khoekhoe and San knowledge are now intellectual property of universities. Universities are complicit in the erasure and violence against the Khoekhoe and San. However, they were unsuccessful in their attempt to erasure because the religion, the custom, the language, and the knowledge survive on the margins of the colonial and apartheid state. And what was presented here today is that it's still there. It survived. It has been passed down from one generation to the next. For example, the Tabara that we saw here is a Khoekhoe dance, and it's considered one of the oldest dances in South Africa. This dance is still practiced today. Since dance choreography is the notation of dance, the Tabara wrote the historical record of the Khoekhoe people in their bodies. So if you study the dance in various regions, you will see there's various historical narratives that comes from it. So it's not just a dance, it's an archive. The Tabara preserve the memories and history of the colonized in the bodies of the colonized. It tells a story the Khoekhoe and San understands. Finally, I want to conclude with a quote from President Thabo Mbeki's I'm an African speech. I quote, "I owe my being to the Khoi and the San who desolate souls haunt the great expanses of the beautiful Cape. They who fell victim to the most merciless genocide our native land has ever seen. They were first to lose their lives in the struggle to defend our freedom and independence, and they who as a people perish in the result. Today as a country, we keep an audible silence about the ancestors of generations that live, fearful to admit the horror of a former deed, seeking to obliterate from our memories a cruel occurrence in which its remembering should teach us not and never to be inhumane again." So there's a contemporary trend, and that is to make us feel guilty because we lost our native languages and we do not look like museum artifacts. So if you go to museums, there's a specific way of looking Khoekhoe and San in South Africa. If you don't look like that, then you're not Khoekhoe and San. If you don't speak the language, then you're not Khoekhoe and San. To those who are trying to shame the Khoekhoe and San people because they do not look like the caricatures that the university and museum created, to you I say, this is another attempt to silence us and to discredit the horror of the erasure. You are seeking to obliterate from your memory a cruel occurrence. We are not the images that universities and museums created. We are more than that. See us for who we are and not as the bastards of white people, because that is what colored people is supposed to be considered. That is a racist discourse that was created in the university. We are not dead. We are not frozen in time. We are alive. I want to finish with the words of Pieter van der Westhuizen. My asbrood is niet te koop. It means my culture, language, religion, and knowledge are not for sale. So, what Hendrik said, Hendrik Witbooi, during the Nama, he said, "Tua tamat pamsge," means the struggle continues. I thank you. Kei gangans.